Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this, our fourth webinar in the Energy Transition Academy series. My name is Pam Eaton, and I'm a consultant with the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University. Hope everybody was able to join our previous webinars and that you enjoyed a little bit of a break from Zoom over the last week, maybe. If you need to refresh your memory about what we've already covered in this series so far, you can watch the recordings on the CNEE website, and we'll put a link to that in the chat box. All right, and now while folks are getting settled in, I'm going to run through a few reminders. First of all of us in this academy are from the Rocky Mountain West. And this webinar series starts with the realization that there is an energy transition happening across the country. There are about 200 communities that are facing the very rough and tough reality of coal mine and plant closures over the next decade. And we're here to talk about how we can help the communities who have provided our reliable electricity from coal for many decades, the workers, their families, and their communities. And as we've done throughout this series today, we'll hear from speakers who are community leaders, coal plant workers, economic development professionals who live or work in coal country. And we might even have a little extra time at the end today of the session today for questions, but the real discussion time will come on December 8th at 11 o'clock. So write down your thoughts and questions. And we know that the time for conversation among the participants has been very limited, and we really want to hear your suggestions for how to have longer and more opportunities for conversations. We can provide Zoom rooms maybe after our formal discussion time, or whatever will be helpful. And please just let us know your ideas for how we can facilitate that kind of communication. We also sent out a list to everyone of all the participants and speakers' contact information, so you can continue these conversations directly with each other. And we know you all don't always get to hear from each other or work directly together, so we really are heartened that so many of you are tuning into this virtual gathering. So thanks for being here. Now I will read the Colorado State University Land Acknowledgement, which is an official statement honoring the ties of Indigenous people to the land on which the university operates. Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also the site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land-grant institution, and as we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion, and significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. All right. This next slide is some ground rules for discussing this topic, which can be very political and emotional. We're talking about some really big changes, which is hard. So we're going to try to stay on the high road and focus on the people going through this transition and how we can help them. Next, we have some Zoom tips, and you'll see other tips in the chat box. Can you advance this slide? Is there? Oh, there it is. If you have questions for the speakers, you can type them into the chat box. And if we have time at the end, which we hope we will, we'll take those. And if we don't have time, we'll save them for the December 8th webinar. This webinar is being recorded, but that discussion on December 8th will not be. So with that out of the way, I'd like to welcome our four speakers for today, Representative Angelica Rubio, Cindy Windland, Sabrina Nyman, and Kirsty McPherson, who will talk about our topic for today, inclusion is intentional in the energy transition. Unfortunately, Mayor Mike Corianos of Price had a work emergency today, so he won't be with us. But hope we can find another way to hear from him. So Representative Rubio will start things off. Representative Rubio was born and raised in rural southeastern New Mexico and is the youngest daughter of Mexican immigrants. She returned to New Mexico over a decade ago to organize in the Permian Basin and later settled in the border community of Las Cruces, where she now serves as a state representative and vice chair of the House Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee. Welcome, Representative Rubio.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here today. I know that even 8 months later, as we endure this global pandemic, I don't think Zoom gets any easier for any of us. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Again, I represent the great city of Las Cruces here in the state of New Mexico. And I, first and foremost, before being a legislator, I'm also a community organizer. And I have been doing community organizing for well over 15 years. And part of the reason why I serve in the legislature, and sometimes I serve so passionately in the legislature, is because of the many stories that I get to hear on the ground each and every day. And I just saw a chat from Secretary McCamley, who I really appreciate as well. So I'm glad to see him on. I am here to talk to you all about inclusion and what that looks like for the work that I've been doing, particularly around this issue around energy. Through my introduction, as Pam mentioned, I was born and raised in the southeastern part of the state of New Mexico, which is where a lot of our economic revenue comes from as a state, including a lot of our economic development. And so when we're talking about economic diversification, it's really a big part of my life because 99% of my family, either directly or indirectly, has a connection to their livelihood through extractive industries. And so while I am a conservationist and an environmentalist and someone who enjoys the outdoors and is working really, really hard to protect it for generations to come, I also recognize that so many of our communities across the state need extractive industries to survive. And so when I entered the New Mexico State Legislature, pretty quickly I realized that my lane would be to bridge those two groups of environmentalists and the folks who are I guess industry. And so this process was through the ETA, the Energy Transition Act. Although I wasn't heavily involved in the process, the organization that I was working for at the time was heavily involved in making sure that the Energy Transition Act really led was centered on people, and that the workers would not be left behind as we started talking about transitioning away from coal and thinking about what was happening in the northwestern part of the state. And while there was a lot of conversation and a lot of really great negotiating back and forth amongst these communities, particularly when it came to those being directly hit on impacted on the ground, Native and Indigenous communities were still very much not a part of the conversation. And up until the last 24 hours, right before the final vote for the ETA, I was still not sure if I was ready to vote for it. And a lot of it had to do because of this issue around inclusion. And even though it wasn't unintentional, it was still an issue that we were dealing with. And I decided at the last minute, and my apologies, I have a new puppy, so she's probably going to be making a lot of noises. What we encountered was that it wasn't perfect. And as a policymaker, I've come to realize every year that I've been serving that especially as fractured as our legislatures can be across the country, where we're limited on time and on staffing, and in our case, we don't get paid for this work. It's sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity to get good policy through, even when there's some things within these pieces of policy that don't serve everyone. And so that was the ETA. And the ETA for me, it was really about the immediate importance of how people were going to receive what they needed, especially in the northwestern part of the state, when it comes to work development, job development, training. All of that was super important to me. One of the things that was actually left out of the ETA, and we managed to be able to get it done, and through the support of Secretary McCamley actually, is the workforce development study, which was left out of the ETA, but we managed to find a way to pay for it. That study was completed this past summer, and it's the framework that we're using now to build to work on a piece of legislation related to just transition. And it doesn't solve all the issues around just transition, because just transition is a really big deal. But the reason that I bring it up is because our history of coalition work requires that the people that were involved in the ETA are a part of the conversations now with just transition, but also that we're deepening the relationships and cultivating a lot more of those relationships so that we can make the just transition legislation that much stronger. And not only stronger, but also strengthening the ETA as we go along. These have been conversations that we've been having over the course of the year. And as I mentioned to Suzanne and Pam a couple of weeks back, is that after having a conversation with even some young organizers in the Dene community a few weeks ago, exclusion is still occurring. There's still communities that are being left out, even with this conversation around just transition. And so what I am really encouraged by this conversation that we're having is that, one, that if we're willing to really think through these issues that we're working on, that we're being intentional about the fact that we're going to try really, really hard to bring as many people into the conversation. And when I say that intentionality, it's not just about consultation, because I think when we talk about legislation, especially in the ETA and other parts of legislation that we've passed statewide, we always say we're going to consult with Native and Indigenous communities. But we have to actually go further than that. We actually have to go to these communities and have them lead these conversations. And sometimes we must take a step back, regardless of whether or not we think we know better. Because I will be completely frank in that I am not a policy wonk. I know that there's details upon details around how we get to places that we need to go. And a lot of times it's better to be able to talk about policy in a way that is that in a way we can actually translate that into for other people, like myself, for example, that it's not necessarily just about policy and making sure that that's right, but that it's done so in a way that communities understand what's going to be the initial impact on their communities, and then what the overall long-term impact will be as well. And I think those conversations, while they can't just happen in a day or two, I think we just have to be very intentional about how we do that, especially when we're talking about legislation that is going to directly impact the communities that we're serving. And so I think here in New Mexico, it's a work in progress. We are really trying to figure out what our role is in New Mexico, a state that is heavily reliant and dependent on extractive industries for survival, but also really thinking about how our state is being impacted through by climate change. We're one of the first states to really see how that is really impacting us through drought, through a bunch of different other issues. And so how do we address all of them without leaving the communities that are going to be hit the hardest first? How are we going to work to impact, to find policies that are going to impact them, but in a way that is including them in a lot of these conversations. And so I think for me, with the work that we're doing with the Just Transition, we're trying to get it right in preparation for the January session. I think it's 3 years in the making, and it's not going to solve all the issues that we need to solve. But I think that through the work that we've been doing, through this coalition that I've been working with, a coalition that I guess I'm just lucky enough as a legislator to have come from a community organizing community, that I already had a lot of these relationships cultivated and established. And so it was easy for me. It's been easy for me to have them lead a lot of these conversations. But how do I also use my leadership in the legislature to wield some of the power to make sure that more people are involved in these conversations? And so I think it's a matter of that balance. And so I'm looking forward to being able to share with you all later on, hopefully in the next few months, some success stories that I think will be important for the work that you all are doing across the country, but also some best practices of what we might have missed and what we might have done better. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful. I think there may be folks who don't fully understand or have background in what has already passed, and but I think we can maybe dig into that a little bit at the end if there's time. So thank you very much. And then next we're going to hear from Cindy Windland. Cindy, or Carlin, I guess you can start pulling up the slides while I do a quick introduction. Cindy is a senior fellow at the Just Transition Fund, where she provides consulting assistance focused on technical assistance and planning in communities impacted by the transition away from coal assets. Cindy has worked in Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, and in Montana, all locations that pose unique opportunities to promote successful transitions. So thank you, Cindy. Welcome.
Great, thanks, Pam. I'm happy to be here. I will start out by giving you a little bit of introduction about the Just Transition Fund. It was established 5 years ago to address the needs of communities as they transition away from coal. We believe the energy transition is complex and will require more than one kind of solution. And so we focus on several key strategies of our framework, and these are listed here. Our overarching goal is to build resilient communities by advancing economic solutions that are equitable, inclusive, and sustainable. And that's what we mean when we talk about just transition. And next slide. Thanks. So we have a fairly unique approach. We believe that problems need both funding and technical assistance. And so we operate as a hybrid. We're part grant maker, part technical assistance provider. There's a couple important aspects about how we work, and that is that we're nonpartisan, we're neutral, and we bring all voices to the table, engaging as many of the diverse stakeholders that we possibly can. But in order to do that, we do come with a neutral stance and stay away from any political kinds of discussions. And we're fully supported, so there's no cost to a community. So that's a little bit of the ad for our work. We're available to work in communities throughout the country and some of our priority states. So a couple other things that I'll expand on when we talk a little bit more about inclusion, and that is that we only go where we're invited, because we think that coming in from the outside, and we've seen this, is very difficult, and sometimes it's hard for people to develop trust in our work. And so we want to be sure that people are ready to have a conversation. We bring a national perspective, but we certainly don't bring our idea of solutions that we would like to impose on other people. We're here to listen, to figure out what the community needs, to help them get started in planning or fill gaps as they go along the way. Because we're pretty strong in our belief that we think that the best ideas are those that are generated and will be sustained locally. Next slide, please. So a couple things, just a little bit on the academic side of how we approach intentional inclusion. We look at multiple aspects in the community, listening for values. So obviously the design is important. There's the geography, the demographics, the typical things. We also are looking for the lived experiences of people. Sometimes they're workers, sometimes they're people who have lived in the shadow of a coal plant. Sometimes they're people who have made their entire livelihood and maybe generations of their livelihood. And so for us, it's important that we want to hear about what has gone on, and with the intentional experience of bringing out people's experiences, their grief, importantly, their communal values, their personal values, any kind of goals that we can hear. Because we want to not only hear, but we also want to give an opportunity for people to be involved. And as Representative Rubio said, that it's more than consultation. We want people to be involved in what is happening. And so the other important thing is, you know, we talk about designing, but we think it's really important that the groupings that make sense in a local setting are those that are used. A couple things about the messenger, and the messenger can be the facilitator or the person who delivers the information, but the cultural competency is key. And I have a couple examples. Neutrality, again, a certain level of immersion, going to people as opposed to having people come to you, and then timing. And timing is for us, you know, we talk about the importance of being invited, but timing is when the community is ready to move ahead. Not that we don't want to acknowledge the fantastic contributions. And again, we talk about it in terms of grief, but also that we aren't going to spend time looking at blame and other kinds of things that aren't going to be beneficial in the future. So as I mentioned, that it is pretty difficult to come in from the outside, and building trust takes time. And so, and that can be true if you're on the inside too, if whomever is gathering your community input is either has to prove that they can be trusted or has to prove that they're neutral. It takes time. So let's just look at a couple examples. Next slide, please. We talk about inclusion as being iterative. And so you might notice there is not an agile process diagram or the typical circles that you show, you know, that here's how we have, you know, iterative learning. But the important thing to recognize from this, and this is what I try and think about here, is that people say and hear and process things very differently. So this isn't new, but it does say that there's a lot of things to take into account when you're trying to be inclusive. And that is that you have to play back what you've heard. So in the process of hearing is to distill and to create the principles, then to go back and have the discussion again and make sure to test what you've heard. So of course, you know, systems thinking would say that we start with the goals and we create outcomes through identifying scenarios. And that's of course my quick and dirty definition. But in reality, it's a lot less structured than that. And part of being inclusive and being intentional about it is being okay in that kind of setting, is that you're going to hear a lot of things that need to be distilled, replayed, come back and revise, and then move on. So the next slide shows an example of what we think was a really good inclusive process in Tonawanda, New York. Tonawanda is a suburb of Buffalo. And this planning process was driven by a community-based environmental organization that was focused on organizing in the community. And they were organizing for clean air. And so by virtue of their purpose, there were many, many people who had lived in the shadow of the coal plant who were able to participate. But because this was going to impact primarily unionized members with the loss of a tax base, there were union representatives from across the board, which was very unusual to have the teachers, the government, the IBEW all in the same room. And it was incredible representation. You can see that they had surveys, but they had residents, and there was a cross check to make sure that these residents were both demographically, geographically, home ownership, all kinds of other aspects to try and get all the different views of people who might be impacted. And then 20 local organizations to not only talk about their impact, but then to hear what these things, what was being said, so that they might be able to respond with the work that they do. So this was synthesized, as I mentioned, into some guiding principles, which took a lot of hearing, and our purpose there was to do some of the facilitation, primarily during the implementation process when organizations were jockeying for position or jockeying not to do the implementation work. But the other interesting thing about the implementation side is that the aspects of how to move ahead from an economic diversification standpoint actually had an assigned responsible party or parties, and it included people in the public sector, or people who were part of the public, people who had been part of the input. So there was also, again, a lot of emphasis on hearing, a lot of emphasis on involving, and a lot of iteration. And I can attest that it wasn't very clean in terms of trying to get to what we considered more of a community consensus. And then the last example is a little bit different. It's about an impact analysis that we helped design as well as fund in Minnesota. And Minnesota has 5 baseload power plants that were all potentially at risk of closing. Some of them are definitely closing. You can see some of these here possibly on your slide. But an economic analysis looks at, this one in particular did some quantitative analysis and some qualitative analysis. And in the qualitative analysis, it used a typical predictor model of in-plan. And in-plan then talks about what the economic impact is going to be based on sectors. So it's the direct impact, because everything is driven by the worker, the indirect impact, and then the induced impact. But the real interesting thing about this is that while this is the first step in doing a comprehensive economic development plan, it also highlighted who wasn't being heard. And so when you look at the sectors, those are people who have jobs. Those are traditional jobs that are tied by NICS codes to when a coal plant closes. Not everybody and most people don't work in those sectors. And so the quantitative analysis, while necessary, was also a great example of here's who we have not tried to figure out how this is going to impact them financially. So to me, that is a great learning. And likewise, in the qualitative participation, there was a community survey, and there were interviews from local government officials. And I put a quote here in from one of the authors, Audrey Partridge at Center for Energy and the Economy, about the importance of hearing people's stories, and that our task was to be neutral, to bring all these stories together in a productive way, to come up with some synthesis of recommendations, but to recognize that these are all from a unique voice. Every single community is different. And so it was in this case too, in the qualitative participation section, you could also see who wasn't heard. And interestingly, for those who did answer, there were opportunities to say, I don't know anything about this. I didn't even know the plant was at risk. I don't know what it means when it closes. Do I care? I mean, and unusual in a survey, which usually is looking for positive, a reinforcement of this A, B, or C. This was saying, who doesn't know? And of course, this missed a whole lot of people, because people who answer are obviously, they either have a government job who were interviewed, they must own a computer to do the survey. But what the importance with this is to come back then later on and to bring these results back into the community with an intentional focus on getting the people who were missed in both these sides, and to test what was heard in and learned in both the quantitative and the qualitative to see, does that match? Is this really reality? Or is this not who's really going to bear the greatest brunt of this? So that was also a really interesting example. So with that, I think this would be a great time for us to turn to our panelists. And As Pam mentioned earlier, we're sorry that Mayor Mike Karanos is not available, but we are thrilled to have both Sabrina Nyman and Kirsty McPherson. So I'll introduce them now, and then we have some questions for them. And then we're hoping to have a greater discussion with the group, and I think we'll have some time for that. Sabrina Nyman is a staff member of the Montana AFL-CIO, working in Colstrip as the Power Grant Coordinator. She has her bachelor's degree in business from Montana State University and her MBA from the University of Montana. She has a background working in finance, marketing, and operations management. She lives on a farm outside of Colstrip with her husband and their 4 children, where they are choosing to stay and raise their children despite the challenges the community is facing. And then Kirsty McPherson, happy to have you today too. Kirsty is a behavioral economist whose research has focused on economic development throughout her career. Working with dozens of communities across the US, Kirsty has identified key practices to enhance economic development and answer the most common problems our communities are faced with today: workforce attraction, business expansion, and community interest. So thanks again. And Sabrina, I think maybe we can start out with you and ask a few questions about your experiences. And maybe you could give us some more background. You were involved in the Community Impact Advisory Group discussions that happened in Colstrip, and now serve as the treasurer of the Colstrip Impact Foundation. So maybe if you could describe a little bit about why the group was there, because it was intended to figure out use of settlement funds, and then describe the fund a little bit for us and about the process for creation and how was the community engaged in that?
Sure. So our community fund was, we're really unique. We were, our Attorney General intervened in a rate case in Washington. And so we ended up with a $10 million settlement out of that. And then part of that, there was a stipulation that this group be formed to determine how we were to use the funds. So that was called the CCIAG, and it's the Colstrip Community Advisory Group. And they were jointly chaired by our governor and our attorney general. It felt like a bunch of politicians that came into our community to kind of tell us how our community needed to spend these funds. And so even though I'm very involved and my job has me constantly involved in coal transition, I wasn't made aware of any of the meetings until about halfway through. And then I started attending and trying to get people to attend with me. Most of the time it was myself and 2 other community members that would show up because people either thought, oh, the money is already spent or our voice doesn't matter. And that's where I met you, Cindy. And I know that our governor had asked you to come in and try to help facilitate some communications with the public. So there were a few community meetings set up in the evenings because the CCIAG met during the day when everyone was working. So it was kind of impossible to get there unless you were being paid to be there. And then out of the community meetings, I think that loud and clear it was heard that, hey, we don't want any of these funds to be held by the government at any time. And we as a community want to decide what's best for these funds. So from that is where they set up our community board, and they had to have, let's see, we have a county commissioner, we have a city council person, we have a member from the International Brother of Electrical Workers Union, a member of the Operating Engineers Union, an economic development professional, and then 2 community members. And then they also set 3 guidelines that we needed to focus on, and that was workforce assistance, economic development, and tax district stability. So we're a pretty diverse group. We have a lot of money to work with, and it's really nice because we're able to actually hear each other's perspectives in a smaller setting that feels safer than the big CCIAG group was. I think we're also able to bring in more perspective from our friends in the community because they're willing to talk to us as opposed to the governor's right-hand man.
Great, thanks. And have you been able to take advantage of resources that are available to coal communities, even though you know the final closure dates of units 3 and 4 remain uncertain?
Well, my job right now for the past 2.5 years has been to facilitate the power grant in our area. And the power grant was written to be proactive. We were supposed to get in there and try to help train workers before they were laid off. Because if someone's laid off, they're not going to be able to, go to school or get training. They need to find a new job right away. So that was set up. We were awarded a grant, but unfortunately that money came through the WIOA program. So then our Montana Department of Labor and Industry had to administer that grant under those guidelines, which made the grant not proactive anymore. We weren't allowed to assist people until they were actually laid off, and they had to be directly employed with the coal, either at the coal plant or a coal mine. So any secondary workers, any of the boiler makers that would come in to do the welding, that's 75% of their income. They would come in for overhauls. They weren't eligible. A lot of other contracting groups were not eligible, but somehow Burlington Northern was eligible, the trains. Just a lot of stipulations put on the money and a lot of inconsistencies. We were able to help 16 people with the actual power grant, with the timeline being set proactively and then the grant being reactive. We were kind of off by a couple of years. So most of the people we helped came towards the very end. We've petitioned the state and asked them if they could get with the feds and extend this, because there's still a lot of money left on the table, but they're not going to do that. So the grant will end on the 31st. When we did realize the grant was not going to work the way we wanted it to, the state did free up some money for us called layoff aversion funding. So we got about $55,000 to be able to use the way we originally wanted to. And we were able to help train 33 people. And mostly it was, these people are very educated and have great experience, but most of their experience is at the coal mine or plant. They've worked for 40 years here. So what we try to do is kind of help them pad their resume. We did CDL training. We did some additional welding training. We had a bunch of people take advantage of some EMT training, just things that might, help push their resume to the top if they do go look for a job elsewhere. So we have been able to take advantage of that.
So Sabrina, could you just explain a little bit more about the power grant, what it is, and it's the federal funds through?
Yep. It was a federal grant awarded to our state Department of Labor and Industry. And then they contracted out with 4 providers. The Montana AFL-CIO was one, and then 3 community colleges in the area. And one of the community colleges opted out almost right away after they realized the restrictions were going to be too much. And then our job was to help train and transition these employees from coal impacted areas.
And so the power grant was started under the Obama administration and is administered through the Economic Development Administration, and is actually a combination of what started out with 8 federal agencies that were able to, you could essentially apply via a common application. And since then, in the current administration, it was renamed Assistance to Coal Communities, but the funding is still there. And I believe I just read today that the next administration is going to enhance it even more. So hopefully we can get some of those issues that make it unusable, if it's through the Department of Labor, settled with that. So, and then just one last question, Sabrina. So as communities face the decline of their coal industry, whether it's fast or it's gradual over a number of years, they have challenges for their people, the workers, economy, the tax base. Do you have any advice? What advice would you give communities trying to balance all these competing needs?
I think everyone needs to come together, and there needs to be a big group. People need to feel like their voices are heard, because especially, in my town in the 90s, we were the heroes. We were providing power for Washington and Oregon, and we were doing this great thing in this tiny little community, and now we're villains and we're destroying the planet. So that's really hard, and we need to get involved from the community out, because like you said before, it's really hard for an outsider to come in and try to offer help because, we're very skeptical at this point. So I think as a community member, I would encourage people to get involved because, at first we thought, hey, that $10 million is all spent. But the more we kept pushing and being involved, I feel like the more our voices were heard. And now we are able to control it locally. So I would definitely encourage community members to speak out. And even if you feel like you're being annoying, just go to those and, speak up and tell them how you really feel. So.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much. Let's move over to Kirsty here with some more questions. Kirsty, you've worked on economic development and economic diversification in communities all across the country. And now your own hometown, Craig, Colorado, is facing change. What do you tell your clients that you think your community and other communities that are facing these kinds of changes, what should they know?
Yeah, so I guess I should start kind of by saying, so I work all over the US. My main clients right now are in Kentucky, northeastern Kentucky, Minnesota. So on your map, you had Cohasset pulled up. That's my service area. So I'm working in Itasca County right now. And then I also do some work in my hometown, but I also am doing work with the county of Charleston, South Carolina, and various other places across the US. And what I will say is that everywhere you look, transition is happening, whether it be from energy transition, such as what we're facing in Craig right now, or transitioning away from other large resources like timber or millworking, anything like that. So we're kind of at a big flux in our just kind of industries as a whole across the US, which is what has been happening since the dawn of time, right? Things never stay the same. However, now with globalization and everything that we're seeing, there's a lot more of a personal connection to what these things actually mean. So transition is a very, very emotional and personal thing. And I'll say that from the get-go, and we've already kind of talked about it a little bit on this call. There's a lot of emotions involved. Everybody wants a seat at the table. Everyone kind of wants a voice about why this is important and what's going on. And everybody wants to know that their industry is important, right? One of the major things that we see is the huge cultural shift that happens within these communities. It's kind of this loss of identity, if you will. And so that's one of the biggest impacts that I see as far as like right from the get-go is when you are told you are X for a very long period of time and all of a sudden that's taken away, you have a huge loss of identity, which means your workforce is confused, your small businesses are confused, and everyone from the upper levels all the way down are confused about how to help you because you have that loss of identity. But I will say within all of that, there's a difference, a massive difference between communities that knew things were going to change and prepared for that change when things happened, when things were set up 20, 30, 40 years ago, and communities who just thought that they were always going to have that different piece happening. So there's a very big difference there when it comes to how these communities are interacting with these different changes. A prime example would be a lot of the community foundations that have been set up. A good example as well is in Minnesota and having the taconite relief area as well. So that's a big area and a big focus on how that actually makes sense for these communities to be able to change and be able to transition. Because they knew how to process things and how to be able to gather a resource to be able to use later. One of the biggest conversations, and Sabrina also kind of just talked about this, is workforce compatibility. We're having a very large focus on that with all of the areas that I'm working, just because people automatically assume that if you were a miner or if you worked at a power plant or whatever, you're going to easily be able to transition into something else. So like, oh, well, mining makes sense to transition into any type of other machining or a large scale industry like making widgets, that type of stuff. And that's not the case. So having that workforce compatibility piece, there's a lot of value there when it comes to being able to do different studies and be able to have those different components and bringing in those resources to help with that. Along that same line, though, you also have to look at areas of growth. So when you're looking at where your workforce and where your community is compatible to move into a different industry, you have to look at where the best areas for growth are within the entire scope of the US. So you can see how it's a very tricky type of conversation for most communities, because not only are you worried about the present and all of the different changes that are happening, but also how to enact change down the road and be able to find new industry and other gaps and other areas where your workforce is able to be compatible as well as your community culture. I start getting really excited about this and my words start jumbling. So I think the biggest thing about all of this, and if most communities, especially rural areas, which we see a lot more of the coal and a lot more of the transitions happening at a much more rapid pace, these communities have been studied very closely for 20, 30 years, and they've just been sitting on the shelves. And so there's probably some really good pieces of information in those strategies, those workforce compatibility studies, cluster analysis, all those different pieces to be able to actually start going on and looking at implementation. And so within that, you have to focus on the resources and how to use the resources in an effective way coming down the pipeline in the future as well.
Great, thanks. So how do you, I mean, we talked a lot about the loss of identity, the lack of trust, some of the things that are pretty foundational to get people to look at the future. How do you do that? I mean, you've talked about doing some studies, taking advantage of what's been done before. Sabrina's brought up some really good points about how, you know, it's much better if the locals are running the show and that there's trust, and then you can really figure out what to do next. But you come in from the outside. How do you get people to look to the future?
So I like to kind of say that I'm kind of one of the last ditch effort people. So when I come into a community, it's because they know their change is happening. They know things are happening. There's a level of fear there that probably wasn't there a year, 2, 3, 4 years before. So when I'm coming in, I'm kind of coming in from the, oh, well, you're from the outside, you're here to help, but I'm also not government. So that's another kind of, I'm a private consultant working in an industry that is relatively small. So it's easy to kind of know people and know resources in the economic development world itself. But one of the things that I think is so fascinating, and people laugh at me when I say this, but when you're looking at the long range plans of communities and how to effectively adjust and make these changes happen, there's typically some sort of extra funding that ends up happening, right? Whether that be a severance package from the companies that are leaving, a community fund that comes up, any of those types of things. And it could be small pockets of money, or it could be very large pockets of money, and it could be used one time, or it could be used through an extension of 10, 20 years. My least favorite thing, and I've said this before and everybody always laughs, is the conversation about sidewalks. So when you have community people and you have your community leaders and those types of things in the conversation in the room, the initial things that make sense to do are the things that you see every day, right? So if you see in your community that you have sidewalks that are falling apart and that type of stuff, your initial response is, oh, we have this extra money now, let's build the new sidewalks. It doesn't have to be necessarily a sidewalk. It can be park updates, it can be infrastructure updates, but everybody kind of gets my gist. Those projects, while they're very good, are not effective projects for long-term planning and long-term strategizing on how to make your community survive in 10, 20 years after that major industry is gone. And also this money is very short-term. So how do you make, and it's like the other role that I like to play is I'm also kind of like a weird financial advisor to some of these communities. And how do you make your dollar last longer? It's a retirement package, right? Because essentially, you're getting divorced from this industry. So what resources are you getting from your severed partner, and to be able to make the best life for yourself down the road? So with that though, there's that weird kind of combination of, okay, well, we need to make our space and place a very nice place to live. So that comes with sidewalks and parks and infrastructure and placemaking. But that should be done in a different way than what is used to be able to plan for additional industry in the future. Because everybody needs a pretty town. That's how you end up getting the new industry to move in, because that's how people end up getting workforce to come in, workforce to stay, those types of things. So the bigger kind of conversation around this is that the world of economic development has changed substantially over the last 10 years. It used to just be that the economic developer would focus on job creation and capital projects. Now the economic developer is a workforce development professional, you're a placemaking, you're a community development professional, you are worried about your capital projects, you're a fundraiser, you're a grants manager. I mean, you're doing 23 different jobs within that. So how do you focus on planning for 10 years down the future when you're really focused about how you're going to make an impact in your community today? So being able to create kind of that community plan is super important, and that's where the community comes to the table and says really what they want. But it's also important at this point to bring in outside kind of focus on how do we transition into being something new and something different. And so what does that step look like? So bringing in somebody from the outside that has helped communities walk through that process is super important. Because when you're sitting there from a community perspective yourself, you know what your community needs, and those are also super like important pieces, and those should be included in the 5 to 10 year plan. But bringing in new industry and doing this full transition is much more than just sidewalks and parks and those day-to-day things that you kind of always see. So one of the big things is that you have to make really bold moves, bold changes, and very risky investments. And that's difficult when you're kind of playing with a smaller pocket of money and you're using that to be able to transition an entire 20 years worth of industry and a large tax base and everything else in the hopes that you're going to make the right investment to be able to sustain that same type of level of commitment for your economic kind of foundation all the way through. So you have to really look at that investment, but it's also, I mean, like everybody else said, you have to make sure that everybody's at the table to talk about those things.
So that's really interesting. Just one last question for you, Sabrina, from that. What's the status of the sidewalk projects in Colstrip? That style, are they still, you know, I know in Colstrip they're going to invest $2.5 million and spend $7.5 million. And of those $7.5 million, have they been able to decide how it's going to be spent?
We're actually trying to finish that up in 2 weeks. And we're focusing mostly on, you know, helping out the workers, the workforce, economic development, not by building sidewalks. Our city can do that. And then also, you know, trying to figure out how we can be a buffer for the tax districts. We don't necessarily want to just, you know, it's not very sustainable just to spend that money, but we also want to help with the tax burden to the local taxpayers. So those are kind of the 3 things we're working on. The city itself, you know, they're doing their own infrastructure projects. They said this year that I don't think they'll be affected too much by the taxes. And so I'm not sure what their future plans look like for that.
Great, thanks. Well, at this stage, we find ourselves with enough time to actually open it up for questions. And I think that Susan and Pam have some to start us off. And while we're doing that, if you could type your question into the chat box and we can open that up.
Great.
So
I can jump in here.
all right.
Right. I guess I wanted to go back a little bit to Representative Rubio and ask all of you, you know, I think you're seeing this relationship between the things that are being generated in the local community and actions that are being taken outside of your community to try to help. And so I guess starting with Representative Rubio, maybe you could just talk a little bit about what some of the things that were in the legislation that did get passed, and maybe some of the things that you're trying to address in this new go round once you've gotten your local input or more input from others.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. So with the Energy Transition Act, just a little bit of history is that during I believe it was my 2nd year in the legislature, which wasn't that long ago, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. The ETA was actually introduced at the very last minute of a 30-day session under our previous governor, and it was starting to move really, really quickly. And it was really aimed at how to address one of the utility companies who had decided that they no longer were going to continue on with the coal plant in the northwestern part of the state. And so there was a lot of talk around securitization and all of that. Fortunately, it was stopped. It didn't go anywhere during that 30-day session. But that conversation then led to a year-long conversation with a lot of different people, from environmentalists to conservationists to labor, community organizations like the organization that I was talking about that I was the executive director for, where we do a lot of community organizing and power building. And so we were trying, the ETA at that point was just getting much bigger and bigger. And it was not only to address the securitization and the utility company that was going to be, I guess, pulling out of that deal, but then how are we not only going to replace the jobs, but also how are we going to work towards infusing the kind of job training, workforce development, and then also resources that community needed once this coal plant closed. And so there was a number of things that were included in that legislation, like the workforce development and all those different resources. But the workforce development study, which is the one thing that we really wanted included into this Energy Transition Act Part 2, didn't quite make it. And so that we then ended up introducing a separate bill that didn't actually go anywhere, but because we just had a really great year revenue wise under the new governor at the time, the governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, as we were passing the ETA that year, simultaneously we were trying to get this legislation through for this workforce study, and then we managed to pay for it regardless it making it out. And so the work that we did in coalition, it started from the time that the ETA was first considered as just a securitization bill to when it was initially, and then when it was passed finally in 2019. And then now, as we enter into this conversation around a just transition and what just transition looks like for New Mexico, that coalition continues to really drive not only the conversation and the framework, but also how are we also bringing in more people to be a part of these conversations to make the policy more strengthened in a better way, that while we may not get everything we want in this upcoming session, at least it's our foot in the door to really addressing the overall issue of climate change, but also just transitioning into a greener economy and diversifying our economy beyond just extractive industries.
Great. Well, thank you, Representative Rubio. We have some questions coming in, starting with one for you, Kirsty. Can you give some examples of communities that have made bold moves, the bold moves that you said are essential, and what did they do?
Yeah, so a lot of there's a couple different examples I can give, and we'll start with kind of the basic ones that make this most sense for a lot of different areas. So one of the bigger ones is kind of creating those site projects and site ready projects. So we're looking at shell buildings, those types of things, or you have a marketable product at the end to be able to showcase to a new industry coming in. This is typically risky for rural communities, and I don't see it as much in rural communities. In fact, I don't see a lot of rural communities owning very much property or land. But this is a really big kind of investment potential that communities can do, just because you have something that's site ready. If you don't build a building, at least have something pad ready. And then also make sure that you have incentive packages that make sense for your community. So, I mean, those aren't necessarily huge, bold moves, but incentive packages are one of those things that I think is really important for areas when you're coming into attracting new business. But this is also really important when it comes to able to growing and scaling your existing business and being able to have a very big focus on business retention and expansion. Because typically speaking, a lot of your businesses that exist within these communities are dependent within the major industry that exists there anyways, whether that be coal, mining, timber, whatever that looks like. So it's an important piece to be able to take care of those existing businesses and be able to offer them those incentive packages in order to grow and expand. And so that could be large scale grant programs, those types of different things to be able to ensure that. Additionally, I mean, any type of big infrastructure development projects that you can do when it comes to broadband, tap fees, that type of stuff, that's really important as well. And so those aren't necessarily super bold move, but it definitely makes your community more competitive when it comes to be able to attract these businesses in, or to even just be able to get these businesses to stay there in the first place. One of my very favorite examples, though, of kind of a bolder move that I've seen is not a community that I've specifically worked with, but I've been part of in various different capacities. But Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I know area, but they were really struggling with being able to create new industry, be able to develop kind of those different projects and processes within their own area. And then this young man came in, whom I am lucky enough to call my friend, Aaron Bowles, was able to come in, partner with a foundation, and started a company called Tulsa Remote. They pay people to move to the area. They pay them $10,000. They put them up a place to live. They create a kind of a cohort, but they also offer co-working space, these different types of things. Within 3 years, they've had over 200 people move through that program. Most of them have stayed in the area, have branched off, created their own business, and now it's kind of becoming a newfound tech hub within Oklahoma. Also, Tulsa is now one of the very best places to do remote work. It's one of the best tech hubs. It is on like the best places to travel because of all the different redevelopment sites that have been coming up. And they started this with just about $150,000 that was awarded to them through the foundation. It's not necessarily something that they see an immediate return on because they don't own any of the business, or they don't own any of that. But long range ideals and be able to look at things from a 3-5 year growth perspective, they've already made their money back tenfold. So that's a really kind of interesting project that we're looking at duplicating in a couple other areas. But if you guys are, I mean, I encourage you to kind of look at that program itself, because that's definitely something bold and innovative and had huge growth within a very short period of time.
Great, thanks. Okay, what type of constituencies do panelists think are the hardest to reach or are most often left out? And I'll start off with that one. That I think, as Sabrina pointed out, if you hold the meetings when people are working, they can't come. Pretty simple. The second thing is there's so many people who are struggling to keep a job, raise a family, get to the grocery store, and hope their car starts. And so taking the issue to people where it's easy for them, whether it's lunchroom or doing the survey while people are waiting in line to pick their kids up from school, but the importance of going to where the people are. And then finally, I think that there's a big mismatch in terms of how, when we talk about being culturally competent, that many people don't understand the propensity for a language barrier in lots of communities. And the other thing that you had mentioned, Sabrina, is that people have a sense of desperation. It's already been done. It's already been decided. It's never going to happen for me. And so some way that's where the education and the hope has to start. So that's how I'd answer that one. Sabrina, Kirsty, anything else?
Yeah, I just think, we really need to focus on getting the workforce involved. They're the ones that have been doing these jobs for like 40 years, and a lot of them feel like they don't have a say. And so if we can bring the conversation to them somehow, if you can get into the work site and work with them there, that's probably the best. I really feel like our workers are being left out the most.
Mine, so it's definitely different. It's probably my favorite way to be able to gain some different knowledge and insight about communities, but it's also one of the most difficult is reaching out to the people who have moved away and figure out why they moved away, and what would bring them back to the area. It's difficult to track those people down, but I definitely find that I find the most information from those folks because they're usually people moving away because the industry is changing, or they're people who worked in that industry. And so that's a really important one. And then also reaching out to youth. So be able to have kind of those younger voices at the table, the young professional groups, all of those that kind of don't necessarily think that this involves them, but it very much does. Because those are the ones that are going to be kind of carrying through, and hopefully those are the ones that we're going to be able to convince to be able to stay, because those are the potential new business owners, all those different pieces.
Great. That's helps to build on the theme that we've been hearing about the importance of building trust, the importance of in giving people an opportunity to get involved after they've had their say, or if they want to have more involvement. And then I thought it was really interesting, Sabrina, when you talked about originally you were heroes and now you're villains. And that perception in a community, I think that's an important one with inclusion, is to just see if that can be leveled out, that it's not about a value judgment on the person, it's about looking to the future. So there's another question here that there's concern. How do you help the companies that are in the supply chain of the mines and the power plants that will be in your community? Because if a community, of course, doesn't have a diverse tax base, then you'll end up losing those who supplied the mine. So it's this person has a struggle having a vision. How can you have a vision if it looks like, especially to thrive? And she would like to exclude the answer of tourism from anybody's answer. Tourism is a poverty type of life. So how do you inspire a community to have a vision, to think that they'll thrive again, to support the supply chain?
So I can go first on this one a little bit. I know, and I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier too, business retention and expansion programs are probably one of the most critical things in the very first step. I think that I specifically do a lot when I'm working with various communities. In order to kind of have that kind of clear concept, you have to look at what currently exists, where they're outsourcing, what they're doing. That's how you find the supply gap. That's how you find the different opportunities. But it's also able to help them one-on-one adjust to the new industry. Most of these communities and a lot of these different companies have the potential to be able to outsource, export, all of these different things. And they just don't necessarily know how, or that there's that opportunity. So really kind of having that show is super important. So there's kind of that piece, and I liked the mention of tourism. One of my main things that I always say that was tourism drives economic development and drives business, because people that are moving to an area have an attachment to that area. So if you can find a way to kind of bridge that gap, and if someone's taking their family on vacation there every year, but they also have another business on the other side of the country, manufacturing something or whatever, that's how we see a lot of kind of new like businesses popping up, is because there's that attraction and that kind of interest in that space. Very rarely, and I mean very rarely, do you ever kind of come across a business that is showing up in the area because they just kind of stumbled on it. They like pointed on the map. They're like, yeah, this is it. Especially in these smaller towns and these kind of more rural communities, they definitely already have an attraction, and tourism is typically how they get there in the first place. So I wouldn't discredit that, but I also understand what you mean when it comes to being to create tourism-driven businesses, which are typically more minimum wage jobs. And you have to have a whole other different type of sustainability within that for those communities.
Great, thank you. So there's a comment from Governor Ritter about the importance of bringing in private funding and a partnership between all levels of government, and specifically about hearing what people need. And as a corollary to that, another question here is, people might be interested in learning more about ways to start a community fund, and how does that happen? I mean, obviously in Colstrip there was a settlement, so there was a pretty big nest egg to get going with, but other community foundations, community funds, how do those get started? And I can jump in here. that I know in Montana, the Montana Community Foundation is the umbrella organization for all the community foundations in the state and can help provide the fiduciary and administrative kinds of duties that go with that. I don't know, Kirsty, are you familiar with any of the community foundations in the states where you work?
Yeah, so a lot of the ones that, this goes back to my initial answer earlier on in the panel. A lot of the community foundations that I have been a part of or that I've worked with knew that their industry that they originally had set up 20, 30 years ago was going to change. So they created a foundation in order to showcase that they were going to be able to have a sustainable ecosystem in the future. One of the top ones that I kind of make mention of all the time is the Blandin Foundation in northern Minnesota. This foundation was created by UPM, who now owns the Blandin paper mill. And so it was a trust that essentially started for the community and for the Blandin footprint. That was created a very long time ago. Much like sovereign funds, this is a very big piece of development, especially when you're looking at areas in native and tribal areas, those types of things. But those are different. Those sovereign funds were created years ago. We do have some that are popping up now and around the area of mines and companies that they know that they're leaving. So they're granting $1 million or to whatever that looks like into these community foundations that already exist, but that money will run out. And so it's, again, how do you create these foundations and how do you create these long-term sustainable ecosystems that won't just be one pocket of money, but you're able to regenerate and grow that money in the future. And so sovereign funds have always been kind of the number one way of doing that. But now we're faced with 200 communities that are transitioning out of coal, and we have to look at what can we do now in order to be able to sustain these communities in 10, 20 years, but also have funds available right now. So it's a very interesting challenge. It's definitely laying heavily on the legislators in each of these states, but it's also important within all of these different communities. And like I've kind of already said, this is essentially a divorce happening between your community and this industry. And so being able to get kind of that severance package, if you will, because it's going away, is something that is worth being able to try to negotiate for. And most companies, I haven't seen any companies who aren't willing to do that yet.
So this just brings to mind another example, just to build on Governor Ritter's comment about the importance of bringing in the private sector, that we probably, Sabrina, you might be familiar with in the labor world, there's often labor schools, union schools that have signatory contractors that will actually pay to hire somebody during the day so that they can develop their apprenticeship and become a journeyman or whatever is in a school at night. We recently spoke with Bismarck State College about a program that they have where they're in conjunction with many contractors who ask them to do specific kinds of training to hire people directly into their business, and or to do some cross training outside to move from the mining and or power community into another business. So they do some of that gap training, which has been interesting, that to have the private partnership that way also. And then I think we have one last quick question. Can anyone speak to how typical it is to have a plant or mine owner provide transition funds to impacted communities?
I guess I can start on that one. So our power plant is owned by 6 owners. 5 of them are out-of-state owners. And then we have our coal mine, who is another separate owner. And when 1 and 2 closed down, our 2 units, our older units, they had 2 owners. They had Puget Sound and Talon Energy. And Puget Sound, did provide us those transition funds, but it was not a gift. That had to be part of that rate case settlement, and there had to be some intervention there. We haven't heard from any of the other owners, and honestly, I don't really see a lot of these companies doing this out of the goodness of their heart. I mean, it would be nice considering they've been in our communities for so long, but we're definitely going to look to the other owners for some transition funds as well. But, I don't see it just happening without a little pushing.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we'll have a chance to talk about some other kinds of examples of power companies participating in the community. But at this point, I know we have to wrap things up, so I'm going to turn it back over to Pam and thank Kirsty and Sabrina and everybody for their questions. And Pam, I'll let you wrap up.
Great, thank you so much. This was great. And really appreciate all of you sharing your experience and the challenges and the ways that you are moving through them, and bringing people together to find these solutions. I think, our webinar later this week, which is on Thursday, December 3rd at 11, we'll start to talk about some of the ways that states can be actors and be helpful and partners to local communities, and answer some of the questions that I think people had about, the roles and opportunities to partner with states. So don't forget to watch on Thursday at 11. And remember that you can catch up on all the previous webinars at our website. We also have a growing resources page. I think some of the resources were posted in the chat, but those are also available on our website. So take a look at that. And I really want to hope everybody looks at the micro documentaries about Craig, so that we continue to think about, how and keep in mind how these transitions are really affecting people. And last but not least, give us your suggestions on how to create more opportunities for conversations. Thank you all very much, and we will see you on Thursday.